Lore. Defined by Merriam-Webster as a, quote, particular body of knowledge or tradition, lore has become a hallmark of video game designs as a means of deepening storylines, characterizing NPCs, and enhancing environment, though some franchises are definitely better known for it than others. But what's the point of nuanced storylines and hidden quest lines when a wall of text can accomplish the same thing? The answer, which looks from Dark Souls to Pokemon to historical philosophy, might surprise you. Before we get into explaining why video games bother with lore at all, let's first take a look at 3 games' approaches to presenting lore to their audiences, beginning with the franchise whose lore has perhaps become more well-known than its actual gameplay. Perhaps no game franchise but Scott Cawthorne's Five Nights at Freddy's comes to mind when the word lore is mentioned. Set around the premise of a player character locked in a darkened pizza place, defending themselves from animatronics that have a mind of their own until the sun rises, Five Nights at Freddy's is your typical jump-scare-based horror game that plays upon the uncanniness of animatronics, and yet discussion of its lore has garnered channels like Game Theory hundreds of millions of views. Without interactable NPCs or objects to be inspected, you may be wondering, like the millions of others who have clicked on such videos, how a seemingly simply premised horror game can generate so many questions. But analysis of the game's features will tell you that it's anything but an accident on the developer's end. Five Nights at Freddy's lore, though somewhat explained through the game's exposition and the narration of a disembodied phone guy, primarily comes about through Easter eggs. Coined in 1979 by the then director of software development at Atari, the term Easter egg describes a hidden message in a video game that can sometimes be triggered randomly or by accident, typically only caught by keen observers. Five Nights at Freddy's builds upon the typical Easter egg model of references, credits, or jokes by building its lore almost entirely around such randomized occurrences, to the point where in playthroughs, you may not even realize just how vast the backstory of the game you're playing is. These Easter eggs come in a variety of forms. Posters that randomly update from rules to newspaper clippings hinting at grisly backstories, visual hallucinations, and a secret fifth animatronic who appears only 0.01% of the time and crashes your game when encountered. These seemingly random, and often hard to catch, Easter eggs intrigued gamers perhaps more than the initial game mechanics ever did. Five Nights at Freddy's lore is something that has spawned millions of hours of entertainment and speculation, so much so that this short explanation is barely scratching the surface. There are 7 games, for example, and I have basically only talked about 1. But at the end of the day, or night, I guess, what we can take away from this handling and demonstration of lore is the element of randomness involved to find it, and the hysteria that comes from noticing an Easter egg, prompting a closer look at what otherwise seems like a simple horror game about creepy animatronics in a closed-off, controlled environment. As an open-world RPG, Elden Ring continues From Software's Dark Souls set precedent of extensive and nuanced lore. The premier way this is accomplished is through environmental storytelling, in which a game's setting, rather than a narrator or scroll of expository dialogue, reveals the stakes, rules, and conflict of the world. Different from Easter eggs, which occur by chance or separate from the plot, lore can instead be found in the very world the character inhabits and walks about, a common, though extremely important feature of modern RPGs. Every detail of Elden Ring's open world is thought out. In the lands between, environmental clues from corpses to destroyed buildings to bloodstains and broken caravans demonstrate the carnage that has occurred, and oftentimes hint at what's to come in the form of a nearby boss. In combination with short snippets of dialogue from NPCs, which likewise litter the world, seemingly random occurrences of features become much more sinister, such as Celebrant's Village, a commune filled with smiling women dancing, and no men, with a nearby fire inexplicably full of corpses. One Redditor calls this a, quote, WTF happened here moment that is not explicitly explained, leaving the gamer guessing. Quote, little locations like this don't get lore dumps, item descriptions, or references from characters. It's anyone's guess what actually happened, end quote. And anyone's guess it is indeed. A simple search for Celebrant's Village on YouTube yields numerous speculative videos, with even more conversation to be found on Wikipedia and lore discussion pages. Environmental cues like this convey lore in a way that differs from Five Nights at Freddy's more cut-and-dry Easter eggs, though there is definitely no less information to be found. But Elden Ring is not the only open-world game to explore lore through environmental storytelling. From Breath of the Wild to The Witcher, a rich world with layered conflicts, histories, and politics is quickly becoming a requirement of the genre. rounding out my examples is Valorant, Riot Games' first-person shooter that was one of 2 Twitch categories to see viewership growth in the year 2022. After talking about 2 of the most lore-heavy franchises on the market, viewers, and perhaps even players of Valorant may be wondering what a tactical first-person shooter game is doing on my list, given its simple premise of point gun, shoot enemy, and win. But Valorant actually has a surprisingly rich log of lore to its otherwise classic premise, though its distribution and form, 3D animated shorts marketed primarily through social media rather than in-game, mean that casual players might have no idea that such stories exist. These animatics, which often accompany the release of a new agent or map, bring the game's diverse roster of characters to life with voice acting and animation, which, above all else, seek to provide an explanation to the game's stakes, which include the routine detonation of bombs, agents playing against their own copies, and things like resurrection. Where Valorant lore differs from the prior 2 examples is in its constantly evolving form, which mirrors the game itself. Patched every few weeks and with constant agent, map, cosmetic, and mechanical updates, it only stands that the lore should be changing too. This model, perhaps a byproduct of its cinematic methods, is the most separated from the video game itself, and yet still, obviously, effective in capturing viewers' attention. So we understand a little bit more about lore's incorporation and importance in some contemporary video game success stories, but the question remains. Why would a game like Valorant, for example, which achieves plenty of success both as a product of Riot Games and as an internationally competitive esport, need to incorporate lore? Why do they bother building the backstory of their characters and maps when the top streamers and players couldn't care less?
Is this room new?
And this is our research wing.
What's going on out here?
To answer this, let's look closely at what lore really is, using the biggest media franchise in the world's flagship method of conveying information to its players.
Executor, a coconut Pokemon, also known as the walking tropical rainforest.
Like Valorant, Pokemon really has no need for lore in its games. Its turn-based gameplay speaks for itself, and many enjoyers of the franchise actually ignore the story completely. Yet every single Pokemon is given a specific bit of information about them in the form of their Poetics entry that helps to build the world of Pokemon more than its pixelated atmosphere and voiceless dialogue can otherwise. Let's look closely at one entry in particular from the game Pokemon Soul Silver to get a sense of what these entries comprise. Upon capturing a Claydol, the clay doll Pokemon, not everyone can be a winner, we learn that it is said that it originates from clay dolls made by an ancient civilization. Imagine you are playing this game for the first time with no knowledge of what on earth this gray, 5-foot-tall thing you've captured is, and this is the only sentence you're given to work with. Immediately, we are made aware of a, quote, ancient civilization's existence in the Pokemon canon, along with the information that Claydol, whatever it is connected to it, making it, presumably, one of the oldest Pokemon in the game, since very few other Dex entries mention age at all. The entry is also preceded with, quote, it is said, which situates the lore of Claydol into a sort of communal oral history, where the source is so long forgotten that its existence is only ever speculated about as a collective society. Now, most would not read this far into a single Pokedex entry. Players of Pokemon Soul Silver, a game marketed for children, are probably more concerned with collecting their gym badges than unraveling the secrets of the ancient Pokemon world. But for those who take the time to read this bit of lore, their experience is irrevocably changed. Be it when they see a Claydol in the wild, use it on their team, or encounter one in a battle, the knowledge that they're dealing with a piece of history, with something more detailed than its name and type combination, a symbolization of information, makes the game more interesting, more detailed, more immersive, in a way that cannot be accomplished through the otherwise prescribed linear gameplay. But how is it that a single sentence can accomplish this? Marking perhaps the first transition from Pokedex entries to philosophical theories of interpreting history, let's take a look at Hayden White's 1973 book Metahistory, The Historical Imagination in 19th-Century Europe, to figure out why bits and pieces of lore, interspersed in games through environments, artifacts, and dialogue, can shape player experience. There are many ways to approaching games, and there are many ways to approaching history, though one theme underscoring both of them is the idea of a narrative. In games, this takes on a literal meaning, the plot that a player acts out or invents. But in historical philosophy, narrative means the incorporation of primary sources and voices, of looking at the lives and feelings of historical actors. White writes in his introduction, Poetics of History, that modern historical conceptions of the past are a, quote, verbal structure in the form of a narrative prose discourse that purports to be a model or icon of past structures and processes in the interest of explaining what they were by representing them. What this sentence boils down to is simple. One way of approaching modern modern history is viewing it as a summation of first-hand narrative accounts. In his essay, The Burden of History, he even expands on this point by likening history to storytelling, where he emphasizes the graphy, or writing, part of historiography. In viewing history as a narrative, White then breaks down his, quote, historical account into different levels of, quote, levels of conceptualization. The first is chronicle, some amalgamation of information from events, and the second is story, an organized group of chronicles that produces a spectacle with a discernible beginning, middle, and end. The chronicle is simply a piece of the story, a, quote, open-ended event that does not, quote, function as a story element until it is arranged alongside other chronicles to form a historical story. When we think about video game lore, we think about things that have happened before the player logs in, before they press play. Be it the horrific events that preceded your tenure as night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, or the build-up to the conflict we enact on the Valorant battlefield. Lore exists as a sort of separate history itself, a stagnant body of work. If we view the bits and pieces of information we get, the Easter egg or the item description, the Poetics entry, or the bit of dialogue an NPC feeds us as chronicles, the overarching narrative of the game, the story, the history can then be discovered, which, at its core, is the way that players interact with lore. Be it on a wiki page or within one's own subconscious mind, a game with lore and discovery requires its players to piece non-obvious bits of information together to form a narrative that impacts their enacted gameplay. White writes that, quote, it is sometimes said that the aim of the historian is to explain the past by finding, identifying, or uncovering the stories that lie buried in chronicles. By using our metaphor, this would mean that it's the job of the gamer to explain their story through piecing together the information that can be found in lore, regardless of the manner in which it's discovered, a method of interaction that is responsible for all of the immersive, deepening effects lore can have on a video game. Finally, through White's dichotomy of chronicle and story, a number of questions are naturally generated. What happened next? He writes, for example, alongside, why did things happen this way rather than that? This likewise applies to video games. At the end of the day, lore forces players of games to ask questions about what they're doing, or rather what they didn't or could have done. Anything can be meaningless bits of trivia until it is incorporated into the story, so any bit of lore can be important. It's the job of the gamer, of the historian, to figure out why. Video game lore is history, and though it may be fictionalized, it functions in the same way, to provide information and context about a present setting. Whereas in our day-to-day lives, we may not be interacting with objects to discover their secret meanings and definitions, we too engage in White's model of historical narration formation by simply synthesizing the information that is presented to us, which enacts our own vision of the world and the past, whether we mean to or not. So next time you're playing a game and you stumble upon a seemingly meaningless piece of lore, don't just brush it off. What you're dealing with is a piece of history, a chronicle in the greater story of the game that, when interacted with, will enthrall you deeper into the storyline you play and connect you more with the world you inhabit, be it a pizzeria, a dark fantasy open world, or the battlefield of a tactical shooter. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed my video essay. Let me know if you have any questions, and all of my sources should be linked in the description below if you want to view them.